Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's CEAS lecture series, which is co-sponsored with the University of Chicago Library. Our series is an initiative that advances our University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies mission in fostering dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration. This annual series presents eminent scholars who concentrate on the study of East Asia in a variety of disciplines. For more information on the series and who's speaking this year, please visit the check-in table in the foyer and scan the QR code that will take you to the series webpage. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Chelsea Foxwell, the director of the Center for East Asian Studies. Our next speaker in the series will feature Sharon Yoon, Associate Professor of Korean Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Yoon's lecture, Go Back, Racial Exorcism and the Colonial Afterlives of Anti-Korean Hate, will be delivered on Thursday, November 20th, here in this room at 5 p.m. Please be sure to register to attend. Tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be placed online for online viewing, so be sure to visit our YouTube page to find this or other lectures from our past content. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Susan Burns, who will in turn introduce tonight's speaker. Susan Burns is Professor of History, East Asian Languages and Civilizations, as well as Chair of the Department of History. She is a historian of Japan's long 19th century and is interested in the social history of intellectual and cultural practices and the continuities and ruptures between what conventional periodization terms Japan's early modern and modern eras. Her new book, due out this coming spring, is called Mapping Medical Modernity, Urban Space and Public Health in Tokyo, 1868 to 1920. It explores the history of medical modernization and public health in late 19th and early 20th century Tokyo. She's also the author of many other works, including Kingdom of the Sick, A History of Leprosy and Japan, and Before the Nation, Kokugaku, and The Imagining of Community in Early Modern Japan. So please welcome Professor Susan Burns to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that kind introduction. I didn't realize that my forthcoming book is already on Amazon, and that was very happy news for me. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. It's a great honor to welcome Professor Kornel Chang back to the University of Chicago. Professor Chang is a historian of U.S. immigration and foreign policy, and he received his PhD from our history department back in 2007. And he worked with my colleagues, May Nai, who is now at Columbia University, Mark Bradley, and Jim Sparrow. And I was thinking that he is a U.S. historian in their model as someone who's working on the U.S. but is strongly transnational in their approach. And it also, of course, reminds me of Professor Cumings' work as well. Professor Chang joined the faculty of Rutgers University in 2009 and is now professor and chair of the history department there. And we were commiserating a few minutes ago about being chair of a big history department. It is challenging. For those of you that are PhD students, think carefully before taking that step. Professor Chang's first book, called Pacific Connections, The Making of the U.S.-Canadian Borderlands, was published in 2012 by the University of California Press. It examines how Chinese and Japanese migrants to North America negotiated imperial tensions between the U.S. and Great Britain along the borderlands of the western U.S. and Canada. While the focus is on the region between Seattle and Vancouver, Professor Chang argues that this local story has to be understood in light of American and European expansion into East Asia. His story, then, is both global and local in nature. Pacific Connections reveals the complex transnational networks and business empires that facilitated the movement of people and goods between Asia and North America, as well as the racial and political tensions that resulted and which ultimately led to new concerns for border security between the US and Canada. Pacific Connections was awarded the prize for Outstanding Book in History by the Association of Asian American Studies and was a finalist for the John Hope Franklin Prize, which is awarded by the American Studies Association. Professor Chang's second book, A Fractured Liberation, Korea Under U.S. Occupation, was published earlier this year by the Belknap Press of Harvard University, and it has met with similar acclaim. Although it's only been out a few months, it won the Phi Alpha Beta Prize for the best subsequent book in history, and it was shortlisted for the Kornel History Prize. A Fractured Liberation examines how Koreans of all walks of life experienced liberation after 4 decades of Japanese rule. And Professor Chang reveals the period before the Korean War to have been a moment of possibility that was cut short ultimately when Korea began to be reshaped by the U.S. occupation and the expanding tensions of the Cold War. The late Carter Eckert of Harvard University described the work as a fascinating study of a moment in South Korean history that could have set the peninsula on a radically different course, close quote. And our own Bruce Cumings, who I'm so happy could join us this evening, praised it as a work that was both deeply serious and accessible to both general readers and an academic audience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Chang back to the University of Chicago.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction, Professor Burns. Before I start, I just want to thank a number of people. I want to thank Professor Kyung-Hee Choi for inviting me to Chicago to give this talk. I want to thank the Center for East Asian Studies for hosting me. I also want to thank Connie Yip, who I don't think is here, for coordinating my visit. And finally, I want to thank Professor Bruce Cumings, who is taking a short time out of his retirement to be here to act as a discussant, and I'm grateful for it. It goes without saying, my book is not possible without his scholarship, right? My book stands on the shoulders of his work. Just a quick story about Bruce's book. I have a distinct memory of when I read Bruce's Origins. It was between my first and second year of grad school. I had taken a leave of absence. I had returned to New York City to work for a year while my wife returned to school. And I was doing this miserable commute from Flushing, Queens to downtown Manhattan, where I was working at a bank. So I was taking the 7 train back and forth, 90 minutes one way, 3 hours a day. And one of the small joys I had was reading on the train, reading on my commute. And I was reading Bruce's Origins. I can't remember if it was the first or the second one. It might have been the second one. It was rush hour. We were crammed into this train, and like sardines. And as I was reading this book, the passenger sitting in front of me, I could never get a seat, yelled at me saying that the book was too close to him and it might hit him. And what ensued was a light shouting match, whether or not, arguing whether or not this was in fact true. And you would think maybe I would have learned my lesson, but I did not. The following week, I tried to read Friedrich Katz's Pancho Villa, which is like, I don't know if you've seen the book, but if you go to the history department, I mean, it's a doorstopper, right? It's enormous. Friedrich was my advisor at the time. And at that point, I decided that I would not read any books longer than 300 pages on my commute. At any rate, well, I'm really delighted to be back and delighted to be able to discuss my Doom book, Fractured Liberation, Korea Under U.S. Occupation. If you had a chance to read the first few pages of the book, you'll know that the history I wrote was inspired by my family history and the conversations I overheard growing up in my Korean immigrant home in New York City. I wrote A Fractured Liberation in response to a family debate that started in the summer of 1994. In the preceding months, a standoff over North Korea's nuclear program made the Korean peninsula the most dangerous flashpoint in the world. The evening news spoke about a possible second Korean War. That summer, I heard an argument I would hear at every family gathering from then on. My oldest uncle, my kunappa, the patriarch of the family, would champion the United States hardline policy. No negotiating with a crazed regime is how we would put it. Other relatives would chime in, arguing that the US military presence had propped up authoritarians in the South and aggravated tensions all over the peninsula. The debate went back and forth until my kunappa blurted out, "Well, if it wasn't for the Americans, we'd all be living under the communists now." His assertion that assumed it was a choice between North or South, totalitarianism or American military bases, communism or capitalism, with nothing in between, struck and stayed with me. Given the book's origin story, it might not come as a surprise that I wrote A Fractured Liberation with general readers in mind, right? People like my family members. Americans, and I've also learned Koreans, are not aware of the US and Soviet occupation of Korea. But these were, as many of you know here, pivotal years that profoundly shaped the development of the two Koreas. To make this history approachable, I wrote a narrative history, thinking about pace, color, and texture. It has my analysis and perspective, of course. I primarily use the ends of sections and chapters and the conclusion to give readers a sense of meaning. But on balance, I leaned into showing versus telling, hoping to engage general readers and make this important history more accessible. Now, with all of that said, A Fractured Liberation is a work of historical scholarship, rigorous scholarship, I hope. It builds upon the prior works of historians, both here in the United States and South Korea, while also offering a different way to view this crucial 3-year period in Korean history. Since the publication of Bruce Cumings' landmark 2-volume study, The Origins of the Korean War, scholars have largely approached the immediate post-war years in Korea as a period moving inexorably to the Korean War. Cumings' reinterpretation was deeply influential because it challenged the conventional wisdom that the conflict began with the Soviet-sponsored invasion of June 1950. Instead, he urged us to see the war as, at its core, as a civil war, an outgrowth of Koreans' attempts to come to terms with the unresolved legacies of Japanese colonial rule. Cumings argued that the division of the peninsula in August 1945, together with US occupation policies, exacerbated pre-existing divisions and set the stage for the emergence of two competing regimes on the peninsula. US diplomatic historians have almost exclusively adopted Cumings' framework. But they use it kind of slightly differently, right? Some have identified alternative origins moments. Others have shifted the emphasis of blame or causality. But despite these differences, the reason to study the period remains the same, to trace the origins of the Korean and by extension, the early Cold War. And of course, there are good reasons for approaching the study of post-war Korea in this way. The Cold War continues to rage on the Korean peninsula, after all, 75 years and counting. But was the occupation period only a prelude to the Korean War? Did all roads have to lead to schism and war? As a drama moving relentlessly toward division and war, the actions of the great powers, especially the United States, occupy, no pun intended, center stage. Even when Korean perspectives are brought to the fore, they tend to be slotted into Cold War binaries, communism versus capitalism, left versus right, revolutionary versus reactionary. Framing this history exclusively in this way risks obscuring Korean hopes and ambitions and flattening the complexity of their post-liberation experience. What I want to suggest then is that the post-war years were not just a road to war, they were also a moment of broad possibility. The collapse of the Japanese Empire ushered in a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Koreans. After nearly 40 years of foreign rule, this was their chance to start over. It kindled hopes of what a future Korea could be, freer, better, and more equal and just. The electrifying sense of possibility jolted Koreans into action. Peasants occupied Japanese-owned farmlands, workers seized control of the factory floor, and villagers chased the former colonial police out of town. Over the past 3 decades or more, Korean scholars have produced a substantial body of empirical research on this period, painstakingly documenting everything from the number of factories and workers involved in the self-management movement to the land seized or purchased by peasants after liberation. 2 features, however, stand out in this work. First, because academic history in Korea is largely article-driven, studies often focus narrowly on a single group, right? Peasants, workers, women, in a specific locality and a moment in time. Second, many of these works tend toward historical sociology. While this approach offers valuable empirical data, it doesn't quite capture the feel of the moment, the lived experience, that is. Behind the numbers, there were hopes, tensions, and moments of exuberant chaos that evoked a broad range of emotion that I sought to bring to life through Korean literature, film, and music, as well as oral history and memoirs. They are the stories of people like Il-che, who received his draft notice to enlist in the Japanese Imperial Army several days before Japan's surrender. As one of the last of the 3 million Koreans who were conscripted, he would not be sent to the front lines. Instead, he was assigned to security detail in downtown Daegu, not too far from where he lived and worked. The draft notice ordered him to report for duty on August 16, 1945. However, on August 15th, the day before he was scheduled to report, the emperor announced Japan's surrender. Yi must have surely heard the news. The emperor's message was repeatedly broadcasted on the radio throughout the day, including a Korean translation and explanation. Yet on the morning of, he was still weighing whether he should report for duty. What was his hesitation? The empire was no more, so why would he show up for duty? It wasn't that straightforward, however. For a 22-year-old Korean, Japanese rule, which began formally in 1910, would have been all he had ever known. In 1945, more than 80% of the population was less than 40 years old. Also, rumors had been swirling for months about Japan's imminent defeat, and nothing ever came of it. And if Japan had surrendered, why were there still armed Japanese soldiers roaming the streets? So on August 16, 1945, the day after the emperor's historic broadcast, an unsure Yi reported for duty at the Daegu Railroad Station and stood guard for 2 days. It was only after his Japanese superiors had disappeared he felt safe to believe the unbelievable, that Korea was finally free from Japanese rule. After leaving his post, Yi returned to the Mitsubishi Chemical Company, where he had been working prior to being drafted. There, he discovered his Korean colleagues had negotiated severance payments from their Japanese bosses and was in the midst of organizing a self-management committee in which workers would take control of the operation of the company. They planned to convert the wartime plant that produced chemicals for military radars into a toothpaste factory. In a matter of days, Yi went from a colonial conscript to a worker manager who would now help with the running of a factory floor that was once owned by the Japanese. Korean reactions to independence ran the gamut, ranging from the transformative to the mundane, the organized to the chaotic, the high-minded to the self-interested. As Koreans pursued their diverse goals for liberation, tensions and clashes arose. Watchwords like freedom and independence meant different things to different people. They were moving targets that inspired a wide range of initiatives and ideas. This singular opportunity to work out the meaning of independence both inspired and divided Koreans, giving rise to a kaleidoscopic post-liberation experience. One of the more colorful stories of this period comes from Choi Jong-hyu's short story, The Ritual at the Well. It begins with villagers gathered to perform annual rites at the communal well. The troubles begin when a Korean ajumani brings out a plate of bread. In a mad scramble to get a piece, the villagers knock over the plate and bread pieces fly everywhere. One of the villagers accuses Hak-soo, a young man, of taking more than one piece. She suspects he had taken an extra piece for his girlfriend, Mung-boon. Haksu tells her and other villagers who had now gathered around him that he took the bread piece to his mother, but none of the villagers believe him. Hearing the quarrel, Haksu's mother comes racing out with a rag in hand, yelling, "That no good son, it would have been better if he hadn't ever been born." Once she gets in striking distance, she winds up and swings the rag at her son with all the force she can muster. After catching her breath, she tears into Haksu's alibi. "You said you hid the bread to give to your mother? What a liar. And of all the people, why her, the daughter of our worst enemy?" Mongbun's mother hears the insults and emerges from her home to confront Haksu's mother. But before she can say anything, Haksu's mother pulls the pin out of her neatly bunned hair and begins pulling on it with both hands. When she finally lets go, we learn the reason for Haksu's mother's rage. Predictably, it has nothing to do with the bread or how her son lied or even with Mongbun. All of that land out there to be sold, so why in the world did you have to take the land that we had worked? Haksu's mother screams. Mongbun's mother, who had held back until now, finally speaks up. "For goodness sake, who told you not to buy it? When you said you weren't going to buy it, the landlord was selling it elsewhere. So then didn't we sell our soy sauce and kimchi pots and even our pig? We sold everything and bought the land. If you felt that way, why didn't you sell everything and hold on to it no matter what?" This does not sway Haksu's mother one bit. "So what? You wait. I'll raise a pig, sell the piggies, and I'll buy the very land that your family has slaved over. You wait and see." Now, for context, after liberation, Koreans acquired land by two means. They either seized it, which mostly involved Japanese-owned lands, or they bought it for a price. Korean landlords offered to sell their tenanted lands at a heavily discounted price. Rumors of a Soviet occupation circulating in August drove down prices dramatically. Some tenant families pooled their money, others borrowed from local moneylenders, and others, like Mongbun's family, sold off their livestock and household goods. Ordinary peasant families bought up a majority of lands sold by Korean landlords, who put up more than 60% of their tenanted lands for sales in the months after liberation. The sales ignited a massive redistribution of land, perhaps the greatest transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor in the country's history. Without knowing it, peasants had initiated land reform. Internal divisions, however, complicated the story of empowerment and uplift. Yet, as sprawling and contentious as Korea's Asian Spring was, it had a social democratic spine running through it. Virtually all Koreans wanted land redistribution, labor rights, and a reckoning with their collaboration as past in some form. The Korean People's Republic, established by longtime nationalist Yoon Young, along with hundreds of local people's committee, laid out these goals in its political platform for independence. The KPR insisted on complete autonomy and independence for Korea as it worked toward building an authentically democratic state. But most Koreans, not being strict ideologues, many of them were not aware of what political labels meant, were not dogmatic about how to achieve these goals, nor were they necessarily against compromise or cooperation. After liberation, many Koreans pursued incremental changes to improve their daily lives. Tenant farmers secured long-term leases or bought land at a steep discount from their landlords. Workers demanded and received higher wages and better working conditions. Women negotiated nursing at work and maternity leave. For many Koreans, it was less about revolution and more about bread and butter concerns. This also applied to a good number of activists who adopted a pragmatic, even a cautious approach to liberation, especially once they learned that the United States would be occupying the South. Now, the blooming of Korea's Asian Spring was cut short by the arrival of foreign occupying armies. Shortly after Japan's surrender, US and Soviet officials agreed to establish two military occupations, one in the South, run by the Americans, and the other in the North, directed by the Russians. The US occupation government, led by Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, carried out a hardline anti-communist agenda that largely preserved the pre-liberation status quo. Under Hodge, the military government reinstated the colonial police, dissolved the KPR and the local people's committees, and threw their support behind the Korean Democratic Party, a party of largely wealthy, English-speaking Christians, many of whom had collaborated and thrived under Japanese rule. Hodge also brought back exiled writers Syngman Rhee and Kim Gu. In contrast to post-war Japan, where Americans proceeded to dismantle the oppressive control of the imperial state, the US occupation in Korea maintained much of the colonial system. In one of the great ironies of the immediate post-war, Japan, excluding Okinawa, the hated wartime enemy, received democratization and reform, while Korea, a liberated country, got the hard line and discipline. Roger Baldwin, who advised the US military government in Japan and Korea on civil liberties, he also helped found the ACLU, he admitted as much when he said, "It's too bad Korea isn't a defeated country. We do better by them." Following this storyline, scholars have highlighted the forces of repression and polarization, showing how the United States adopted a reverse course policy from the very outset in Korea. The Cold War looms large in these accounts. The partition of Korea in August 1945 becomes the first post-war act of containment, and General Hodge, a premature Cold War warrior. The decisions of Hodge and his military high command entrenched divisions among Koreans and made reunification virtually impossible. But even as a hardline approach prevailed, American and Korean advisors within the military government proposed an agenda of reform to fulfill Korean aspirations. They included New Deal liberals, Christian socialists, and trade unionists who challenged Hodge's heavy-handed anti-communist approach. They proposed land redistribution, New Deal-style trade unionism, and voting rights, and advocated removing collaborators from public life. They were agricultural reformers like Arthur Boons and Lee Young-gu. Boons was a former YMCA missionary in Korea. During the 1930s, he had set up a dozen YMCA schools in northern Korea, in Hamhung province, to teach peasants cooperative farming. He had drawn inspiration from the Danish cooperatives that he believed had established a model social democracy there. Boons had observed very few rich people and practically no poor on a visit to the Scandinavian country in 1928. Yi was a member of the KDP and was appointed head of the military government's agricultural department in September 1945. As a liberal Christian nationalist, Yi wanted to reform, not overturn, the private land system. The two men were kindred spirits. Both were inspired by their Christian faith. Both were graduates of the University of Wisconsin, better known as the Wisconsin School, which was a hotbed for New Deal ideas and policies. It's where Social Security emerged from. And both were committed to remaking the Korean countryside through regulation and reform. If there was any daylight between them, it was their views of capitalism. Boons was a socialist critic of the system, whereas Yi believed its excesses could be regulated through incremental reform. The two reformers authored the bill that redistributed former Japanese lands, close to 900,000 acres, to Korean tenant farmers in October 1947. There were also advocates for labor rights, like Stuart Meacham. Prior to Korea, Meacham had spent the previous 10 years working for the National Labor Relations Board in Los Angeles. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, he attended Davidson College, where he roomed with none other than Dean Rusk. Yes, that Dean Rusk, the US Army officer who recommended dividing Korea at the 38th parallel, and who would later become Secretary of State under Johnson. The two men were apparently very close in college, about as close as two people could be, according to Rusk. But Meacham would later become a thorn in the side of his former college roommate as a prominent leader of the anti-war movement in the 1960s. Meacham went on to Union Theological Seminary in New York City, earning a master's degree in 1934, before returning to Birmingham to serve as a Methodist minister. His ministry included organizing black and white workers in the Jim Crow South. As a labor advisor to the military government, he supported workers' rights to unionize, bargain collectively, and to strike if necessary. Meacham's roommate in Korea, Owen Jones, who was director of the Commerce Department, proposed a law guaranteeing Korean workers these very rights. It was actually modeled after the trade union law that was passed in Japan under American auspices in December 1945. Despite the military high command's efforts to reduce Korean aspirations to Cold War binaries, these reformers knew their ambitions were broader and more diverse. Just as there was not a singular Korean vision for liberation, there was no one American response to their aspiration. In Jeju, the island province off the southern coast of the Korean peninsula, the United States didn't have military government teams on the ground there until November 1945, so about a full 2 months. In their absence, the Jeju's People's Committee emerged as the acting government on the island. And because U.S. military rule came late, the PC had an opportunity to carry out its vision for independence. Jeju thus offers a glimpse into what could have been in Korea had there been no foreign occupation or had it ruled with a lighter touch, and Koreans were left alone to work out their own futures. The Jeju's PC used its newfound authority to remove pro-Japanese collaborators from public life, take Japanese properties into custody, and reopen and build new schools, all the while maintaining public order. They took a surprisingly lenient approach with collaborators, only expelling those they considered the most notorious. All in all, it pursued a moderate course that led to a largely peaceful transition to independence. It did probably help that there were few big landed estates to fight over on the island. Well, when the military government finally arrived on the island, it was pleased with how the People's Committee had governed. So much so, they left them in power. What was remarkable about this was that the Jeju's People's Committee leaned solidly to the left, occasionally even straying into anti-American rhetoric. If Americans could support the Jeju's People's Committees to realize independence in a peaceful manner, one would think they could have worked with the other People's Committees in the South, which tended to be more conservative on average. These stories reveal the contingency of the moment and the paths not taken, reminding us that division and war were not inevitable. But this begs the question, if there was a majority of Koreans who wanted social democratic style reforms and their aspirations had the support of American and Korean reformers, why does South Korea end up with an authoritarian regime led by Syngman Rhee? A Fractured Liberation highlights the key moments where a different choice, firmer resolve, and a twist or turn in favor of unity could have led to alternative outcomes. But before I move on to the story of missed opportunities, I just want to show you images of some key actors, particularly for those of you who are not familiar with this history. This image here is of the nationalist Yo Hyun-young, who had spent a number of years in prison for resisting the Japanese. Yo was, after liberation, Yo was the most popular political leader. He helps establish the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and also has a hand in the making of the Korean People's Republic. This is an image of Park Won-young, the leader of the Communist Party in the South. I should say Park and Yo were on friendly terms during the colonial period. Even though Yo never formally joins the Communist Party, I think the two men see each other as allies during the colonial period. And in fact, Yo officiates Park's first marriage to Ju Se-juk, who was another very prominent Marxist activist, and this is their daughter, Vivian. But after liberation, the two men vie for control over the Korean People's Republic. And their differences stem from dueling visions for who should govern a post-independent Korea, right? A post-colonial Korea. Yo's idea is for a united front, a popular front, that would include workers, peasants, and capitalists. Basically, his only bar was that you did not collaborate with the Japanese during the colonial period. Beyond that, he thought that you had a place in an independent Korea. Park was a doctrinary Marxist, so he believed that a revolutionary vanguard should lead an independent Korea, and he and some of the other leading communist activists were kind of concerned about kind of the organic kind of popular initiatives because he thought they were headless and leaderless and not organized well enough, right? And did not follow kind of Marxist, Marxist values or philosophies. This is an image of Cho Man-sik, who is the Christian nationalist who was based in Pyongyang. Pyongyang was the most Christian city in East Asia at this time. It was actually known as the Jerusalem of the East. I know a little hard to believe now. But he was the most prominent Christian nationalist in Pyongyang. He was, you could think of him something like a center-right version of Yo In-young, but he didn't have quite the pristine record of resisting the Japanese during the colonial period. I should say that when the Soviet Red Army occupies northern Korea and arrives in Pyongyang, they choose him to lead and asks him to form a united popular front. So their thinking was they didn't trust the communists on the ground. They thought the Korean communists in the north were disorganized and weak. But probably the bigger reason was that the idea of forming a popular front was the approach that Stalin was interested in taking immediately after the war. So this was the model or approach he tried to take basically everywhere, in Europe, in Asia, and so forth. And so that was sort of his plan. And I should say it's not necessarily because he was a peace-loving person, but what Stalin was he was ultimately a realist, and he understood the asymmetry of power between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. The United States, of course, had the atom bomb, and the Soviets did not. All right, this is an image of Lieutenant General John R. Hodge. Hodge was a farm boy who grew up in Golconda, Illinois, which was sort of southern Illinois. He, unlike he distinguished himself during the Second World War, but unlike the other, famous World War II leaders like MacArthur and Patton, who went to West Point, Hodge started from the ground up. He actually went to Army Office School in Sheridan, Illinois, and worked his way up the ranks. Just something a little bit about the personality of Hodge that might have shaped the way in which he governed and led the occupation in the South. Hodge was dutiful, conscientious. He was known as a soldier's soldier. He shunned the spotlight. He was much more comfortable reading in his quarters than he was talking to reporters, which made him, which was the direct opposite of his commanding officer, Douglas MacArthur, who was a legendary narcissist. But one of the things about being a narcissist was MacArthur, the flip side of being a narcissist is that there's a kind of flexibility, especially if it can aggrandize yourself, right? And so in the case of MacArthur, MacArthur was an anti-New Deal Republican in Japan, but because he thought he was the only person that could cure the Japanese of their militarism and transform them into a peace-loving people, right? He allowed and encouraged the reformers to institute, all kinds of reforms at the time, despite the fact that in America it would have went against his sort of political values, right? Now, on the other hand, with Hodge was very conscientious, probably had a great deal of integrity, but the flip side of this was he was rigid, and he saw the world in black and white. The other thing that might be worth noting about Hodge was, as I said, he grew up in Golconda, Illinois, southern Illinois in the 1910s and the 1920s. In the 1910s and 1920s, southern Illinois was a kind of stronghold for the Ku Klux Klan. It might have been possible, I don't know, and I was going to ask you this, Bruce. I think it was Golconda, a Sunset, what do you call the towns? It's the sundown town. Was it a sundown town?
I don't know, but I know that my first wife came from Carbondale, which is very near to Golconda. And when I was there in the 60s, it was basically a Jim Crow southern situation completely. Yeah. Except they didn't have separate toilets and water fountains and things like that, but the racism and the segregation and separation of the races was just totally palpable. It was shocking to me at the time. I didn't know. I thought Illinois was a Democrat.
I think it was true, but not Southern Illinois. Southern Illinois was more like the South, it seemed. We're not quite sure how that upbringing shapes, his approach and his values. But, there are moments where he has these communiques with MacArthur or some official from D.C., and he talks about Koreans. And he talks about Koreans in a very kind of colonial manner, right? These people are irrational. You can't reason with them. Things of this kind of nature, right? The irony, of course, was like the people that he had the most interactions were like the Christian, American educated, wealthy Koreans. This is a photo op that was taken in October 1945 when Kim Gu, who's in the middle, and Syngman Rhee returns to the United States. Of course, Rhee was in exile in the United States, got a PhD at Princeton in history, and was away from Korea for decades. And Kim Gu was head of the Korean Provisional Government. When Kim Gu came back, there was a huge welcome back party at Dongdaemun Stadium in Seoul to welcome him back, with tens of thousands of people sort of feeding his return. I think what's interesting at this particular moment is that Kim Gu is probably 1A. If there was going to be a leader that was going to govern the South or lead a Southern government. And I think Rhee was 1B. And part of the trouble that Rhee had was, one, Rhee was gone for decades. And reporters sort of made fun of him, saying that he spoke a pidgin Korean from Hawaii, is what they said. And of course, he comes back with, a white Austrian wife, Francisco Donner, which doesn't really sit well with large portions of the Korean public. This is an image of Kim Kyu-sik, who co-heads the centrist coalition along with Yo and-young. Kim was orphaned at a very young age, at 6 years old. He was adopted by a very famous American missionary by the name of Horace Underwood, who starts the school that eventually becomes Yonsei University. As the son of Horace Underwood, he is sent to the United States to be educated. He gets a degree from Roanoke College in Virginia. He studies literature and English and is quite an outstanding student. When he returns to Korea, his intent is to work alongside his father to start school, but then the March 1st, 1919 movement erupts, and he goes into exile and joins the Korean Provisional Government and essentially acts as Kim Gu's right-hand man and is the foreign minister of the KPG. What's interesting is when Kim is not the foreign minister, he is moonlighting as a professor of English literature at Chinese universities. Kim was always much more comfortable in a library than he was as a public figure. But one of the things that comes up recurrently among American officials when they describe Kim is that they use the word decent to describe him. But maybe it's a low bar because of the other folks that he's being compared to. This is an image of Cho Byung-ok, who heads the Korean National Police. Cho came from a very wealthy landowning family. He is sent to the United States for his education. He obtains a PhD from Columbia in economics in 1928, where it looks like he picked up a liking for bow ties, which he returns to Korea with. Cho is recommended, Cho is one of the founders of the KDP, the Conservative Party. Secondly, he is recommended to be the head of the Korean National Police by Hodge's Korean translator, who's got a record of collaboration. And part of the reason Cho is selected for this, probably the most important role within the Korean bureaucracy, is that he has anti-colonial credentials. He had spent several years in a colonial prison for resisting the Japanese, which made him unique within the KDP. This is an image of Lee Young-gu, who I talked about, the agricultural reformer, just quickly. He goes to the United States and studies with a very famous agricultural economist by the name of Benjamin Hibbard. Is a star, and this is at the University of Wisconsin. He's a star student there. He's recommended to work in the U.S. Agricultural Department, and from there he returns to Korea and eventually is appointed head of the Agricultural Department within the military government in September 1945. This is his kindred spirit, Arthur Boonts. So Boonts essentially follows Yi to Wisconsin. So just as Yi's coming back, Boonts is going to the University of Wisconsin, and the reason he's expelled by Japanese colonial authorities for the work he's doing, forming the peasant cooperatives. He also studies under Benjamin Hibbard, and also works for the U.S. Agricultural Department. Right, these U.S. departments become a kind of pipeline for people working in military governments abroad during this time. And he returns to Korea in the spring of 1946, tasked by the State Department to come up with a land redistribution program. This is an image of Evelyn Koh on the left and Helen Begley Nixon on the right. They are co-heads of the Women's Bureau, which which it becomes important once the U.S. decides to hold the separate elections in the South in May 1948, because women now have the right to vote, right? The military government institutes universal suffrage, and now they have to be educated and taught what the suffrage means, et cetera, and they think the bureau, the Women's Bureau needs to play a big role in this. Now, Helen Begley Nixon was head of the Red Cross in Holyoke in Massachusetts before she's in the Women's Bureau in Korea. But she wants to make it very clear she is not interested in instituting a feminist agenda, imposing an alien, what she called an alien ideology to Korean society. However, she does recognize that there's real kind of injustice within the system that oppresses women, right? Around inheritance, marriage, family registry, right? And she, the hoju. So she's seeking a kind of reform on those, in those areas. And she has faith that it will happen because now women have the right to vote. There's 4 million Korean women voters, right? And she also points to the fact that there's, I forget, it's either 16 or 19 women who run for office in the National Assembly for the national elections. But of course, not a single woman wins a seat in the National Assembly. And in the Constitution that is drafted a month later, among 120 articles in the Constitution, there is not a single article that speaks about women's equality, right? So the suffrage in this case was not enough. And leftist women activists in Korea pointed this out, that, they said, political rights would not be enough, that it would have to be accompanied with economic rights as well. And this is a final image of Leonard Birch. And Leonard Birch is important because he becomes the chief political advisor to General Hodge in 1946. He was trained as a lawyer, I believe, at Harvard. And he comes to serve as the chief political advisor. What he really wanted to do with his life is be a historian. But that did not quite happen. But he uses history quite a lot to talk about different figures. He thinks of Gu and Ri as Kim Gu and Syngmin Ri as Caesar and Marcus Aurelius. This sort of waiting for the last two to stand, and then one of them will wipe the other person out. But he was really important because he was the chief political advisor. His papers are now at Harvard Jenshing Library. They were donated by Alan Millett, who was a diplomatic historian, donated it to Harvard. What's kind of interesting about that is Millett wrote sort of 3-volume study on Korea. And I can't remember him talking about Birch at all or his insights at all, but at any rate. But something like 18 boxes are there. Anyway, the value of his personal papers is, one, Hodge leaves not a shred of personal paper, which is kind of frustrating to a historian, right? And after he leaves, after he comes back to the United States, he does not say a word about his time in Korea, right? So it's hard to get access to what he thought and so forth. Because Birch was the political advisor and he had interactions and conversations with Hodge, it gives you a little bit more texture, nuance, and complexity to Hodge, that, Hodge is not just completely some mindless, knee-jerk anti-communist, right? Which in some ways maybe implicates him even more because he wasn't ignorant necessarily in terms of when he made his policy. That's the first value of the records. The second value of the records is that he socializes and is quite a gossip. And so he goes out to lunches and dinners with all of the political leaders. So you really get a kind of behind the scenes look at, the kind of political landscape among the kind of Korean elites at this time, which is quite interesting. So he talks about how, Kim Gu hates Syngmin Rhee, and one of them are going to assassinate each other when it's the two men remaining and things of this nature, right? He actually met Chang Tok-soo, for lunch 2 days before he was assassinated. And the irony was Chang Tak-soo comes up to Birch and tells him, Kim Song-soo, who was the actual formal leader of the KDP, told him he wasn't being careful enough, that he's going to be assassinated. And lo and behold, 48 hours, it's Chang Tak-soo who gets gunned down by 2 men who are in police uniform at his house. At any rate. All right, so let me just get back to our story. So it isn't very long before General Hodge himself recognizes the error of backing Syngman Rhee. In the summer of 1946, he authorizes talks with moderate rightists and leftists to create a true coalition of democratic parties, leaving the far right and left outside looking in. The left-right coalition committee was led by the pair, as I said, Kim Kyu-sik and Yoon Young. In June 1946, Hodge publicly endorses the coalition committee. And with his support, American reformers thought a third way was a genuine possibility. After months of negotiating between Kim Kyu-sik and Yoon Young, they reached an agreement on a 7-point framework. The highlights included redistributing land with little or no compensation to the big landowners, punishing the collaborators, releasing political prisoners, and guaranteeing freedom of speech, press, and assembly. This is what the political center looked like in the South. But soon after, the countryside exploded into rebellion. The autumn uprising in 1946 were months in the making, as mounting anger over food shortages and police brutality had turned the city of Daegu into a powder keg. The police killing of an unarmed demonstrator lit the fuse. Protests spread like wildfire, sweeping through North and South Gyeongsang and South Cholo province. Nearly a third of all counties in southern Korea were racked by peasant uprisings. The military government responded brutally. By the end of 1946, the Korean police, with the support of the US military, had contained the most serious protests. When it was over, thousands of civilians were dead, close to 7,500 were injured, and thousands more were in prison. The military high command tried to pin the uprisings on outside communist agitators. There was little evidence to support this. Choi Nung-jin, who was the head of the Detective Bureau, found that police abuse, especially in rice collections, was the main cause of the uprisings. Che blamed the department's policy of retaining former colonial personnel for the tensions that flared in Daegu and elsewhere and demanded their immediate dismissal. Che had been making these demands since the beginning of the occupation. Angered by his criticism, Cho Byung-ok, the guy in the bow tie, ousted Che from the police department in September 1946. Now, what's worth noting is that Che was a KDP supporter. He came from a wealthy Christian landowning family and was educated in the United States. He received an MA at Duke and was on friendly terms with Cho before the occupation. The autumn uprisings supercharged a police state in the South. People's committees, farmers' cooperatives, and labor unions suffered extinction. Their leaders were either in prison or underground. Fearing for his life, Yoon Young slept in a different bed every night. He held the unenviable title of the most shot-at man in South Korea. The other coalition leader, Kim Kyu-sik, took refuge in a hospital 10 miles south of Seoul. He gave General Hodge an ultimatum while in the hospital. It was either him and Yo or the police chiefs. Major General Alan Brown, who was overseeing the coalition efforts, laid out the choices clearly to Hodge. They had 3 options: rightist political groups that desire nothing short of an independent government for South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee, an extreme left group that desires nothing short of a Russian-controlled government, or a center group that refuses to cooperate unless the police chiefs are dismissed. For the reformers within the military government, this was an easy choice. They thought the removal of the 2 police chiefs was long overdue, given their extensive record of abuse and corruption. American advisor Richard Robinson wrote, "The police situation has become progressively worse and will continue to do so until Dr. Cho and Chief Chang are removed from office and replaced by men with some conception of liberalism." A draft statement in Leonard Birch's personal papers dated dated April 21st, 1947, suggests Hodge came close to firing Cho and Chang. Lieutenant Birch was the chief political advisor to Hodge, as I've noted. Let me just read an excerpt from this statement. Ever since liberation, Koreans have been hoping and expecting that the police forces would be cleansed of those who betrayed their people to the Japanese invaders. With the passing months, it has become sadly apparent that it was the intention of those in control of the police force not to remove, but rather to strengthen the influence of those who have betrayed their own people. For this reason, using the power that is invested in me, I am hereby removing Cho Byung-ok and Chang Tak-sang from their offices, effective immediately. It never happens. Hodge could not bring himself to remove Cho and Chang. Maybe it was his knee-jerk anti-communism. Maybe the autumn uprisings spooked him. Or maybe he just did not believe a centrist government would work out in the South, that it required a strong man. Whatever his reasons, the Unstein statement remained a draft, yet another reminder of the roads not taken in Korea. 2 months later, Yo was shot to death in Seoul in broad daylight. The dream of a mass-supported, middle-of-the-road political movement which would weaken the extremes and establish a democratic-minded leadership died along with him. Hodge's fear of communism, as his advisor Roger Baldwin put it, became a fear of democracy. By the fall of 1947, negotiations with the Soviet Union were hopelessly deadlocked. Yo In-young was dead, and Syngman Rhee was daily maligning Hodge as a communist in the press. Immediately after World War II, the Soviet Union had accommodated the United States on Korea, agreeing to the American proposal to partition and separately occupy the peninsula, as well as their idea for trusteeship. And as an occupying power, Soviet officials supported Christian nationalist Cho Man-sik over the Korean Communist Party. Stalin's policies in Asia, at least in the first year after World War II, were especially moderate and cautious, according to historian Norman Naimark. The opening, however, closed. In January 1946, Soviet officials arrested Cho Man-sik for his opposition to trusteeship, and during the First and Second Joint Commission, where American and Soviet officials met to establish a unified Korean government, the Soviets demanded the exclusion of rightist parties, which was a non-starter for the United States. Americans feared the provisional government would be dominated by communists if all rightist groups in the South were excluded. Boxed in by Korean aspirations on one side and Soviet intransigence, both real and imagined, on the other, Hodge was prepared to cut bait and withdraw from Korea. That was his recommendation to the War Department. But the State Department, which had constantly criticized the military government's hardline approach, now believed holding on to half the peninsula was necessary to contain the spread of communism and secure American national security interests in Northeast Asia. U.S. policymakers, therefore, developed an exit strategy that would allow the United States to maintain a foothold in Korea without the liabilities of a military occupation. The U.S. would call for elections with the intent of establishing a separate anti-communist client state in the South. Elections would be held in May 1948, a constitution would be ratified shortly thereafter, and a formally independent South Korea would be established by the end of the year. This exit strategy, as everyone involved in the planning knew, would leave Korea indefinitely divided. The decision to create a separate South Korea empowered the reformers to some degree, who were sidelined by the military command for most of the occupation. They passed partial land redistributing former Japanese lands, some labor rights, and universal suffrage in the lead up to the elections. These reforms were implemented only after the United States decided to pursue a separatist policy that would permanently divide Korea into two. And for better or worse, reformers would work toward both progressive and separatist objectives. The last-minute reforms ensured that it would not be a liberation completely denied. Now, this is not immediately apparent, of course. The newly established South Korea comes under authoritarian rule, after all. And the Korean War would follow 2 years later, burying Korean hopes in rubble and ashes. With hindsight, however, we can see that more Korean aspirations in the South were realized, with warts and all, than has been generally thought. But whatever democratic gains these reforms have inspired over the years, South Korea remains one half of a whole. Koreans are still haunted by an unfinished liberation. Thank you.
I would think it was hard for you to navigate between what you're finding
what you think and what I wrote.
Yeah. And I will say, like, not you literally, but I felt you kind of on my shoulder, and anytime we would come up with a thing, I'd be like, would Bruce be like, no, that's not new, like there are moments I did feel this, but part of it is I think the personal collection was the personal connection to this story was just so profoundly important to me, and regardless of how the challenge that I saw in writing this, I really did want to write it, and part of it was twofold. One was it's not just my Kunapa and what he said, but what my Kunapa said about it was either or, that if it wasn't for the U.S. we'd be living under the communists now. I feel like that idea is the bedrock of the main fault line in Korean diasporic politics that shaped the way in which not just my Kunapa, but a lot of Korean diasporic people think, and I think this is also true of Vietnamese and Cubans. That so the fault line in Korean politics, South Korean politics, forever, though I think it's slightly changing now, has been around communism, anti-communism, and I think that's predicated on this notion that it was either or, and I just wanted to write a history to sort of disprove that. The other thing I was interested in was, you of course are one of the only few scholars that actually sort of talk about Koreans and Korean perspectives, right? And then the people who followed you were mostly diplomatic historians, and they didn't really care very much. I mean, I think about David Halberstam's book, which obviously is not about the occupation, but about the Korean War, and he doesn't mention. I don't think he mentions a single Korean in the.
Two.
Oh, he mentions two Koreans.
Yeah, he mentions.
Yeah.
Syngman Rhee and Pak. What's his name?
Pak Chung-hee?
No,
not Pak. Of course not. That's the Korean War.
Yeah, I'll tell you later.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was a general in the army that always was available for American journalists to talk to.
Yeah.
I had an afternoon with David Halberstam about that book, and it wasn't until he got into his second or third sentence that I realized he had no interest whatsoever in Korea.
Yeah.
He was going to tell the story of the Korean War as he understood it as a high school kid. That sort of glanced off of him. He didn't get drafted or anything. And if somebody wrote a book about Vietnam like that, he would be the first to denounce it.
Yeah.
It's a very unfortunate book, but fortunately, I think no one read it.
But this was consistent even of scholars, I feel like, who followed you, again, who were mostly kind of diplomatic historians. And then when I started doing the research, one of the things that did appear to me was the Korean language scholars had produced a voluminous amount of scholarship, and this is part because of democratization in the late 1980s, then which cracked the door open to study these periods and so forth. And so there's been about 3 decades of it. But as I said in my own talk, there are kind of two features of Korean language scholarship, which is meticulously done as far as from a research standpoint. But because it tends to be social scientific, I know it's a social science at the University of Chicago too, but there it's social science and article driven, and there's like multi-authors and things like that. It's a kind of business school science model. And so what you have is, if you have a 40-page article, there's only so much you can cover, so they're going to focus on one group or the other. Again, lots of articles on, peasants, workers and women, and so I wanted to try to bring all of that kind of secondary Korean language scholarship, which it's not been published, it's not been talked about at all in English literature, and so I wanted to bring that to the readers, and then what I wanted to sort of add to that scholarship was, again, so in addition to being social scientific, it tends toward historical sociology. So they're really good at, figuring out like very important things. Like 60% of tenanted lands were bought by peasants after liberation. That's like a really important finding. But like what do these moments feel like? How is this this extraordinary period experienced and lived by ordinary Koreans? And this is where the memoirs, the oral histories, the Korean literature, and so forth, I was able to tap that. And that's the story I really wanted to get into, which is...
Well, I think it's one of the real strengths of your book, that you deal with novels and short stories and try to, find in that literature the actual voice of the Korean people at the time and what they were thinking. I didn't touch any of that. In fact, a lot of it wasn't available when I did my research. But I mean, there's a paradox in that the Korean scholars obviously know Korean, but they often don't know primary documents. At least in 20 years ago, I haven't kept up with it necessarily since I retired. But meanwhile, the American diplomatic historians, they have the primary materials, but they can't read Korean. And I once said, I mean, what would you think of a Korean studying the American Civil War who couldn't read English? And I mean, my entire career, it's been something that I couldn't figure out. Why are you in this field if you don't want to learn the language?
Yeah.
And yet, really, hardly any of them have ever done it. So,
I mean, Alan Miller was interesting because he wrote this 3-volume book, and he talks about the KDP as like these sort of educated, nice folks is sort of the way he refers to them, and that's sort of the end of it. And I think Miller's a very good scholar overall as far as working in the American archives, etc. But when I found out he donated the Leonard Birch papers, it was a bit of a surprise to me. I was just like, there. I mean, so let's say he didn't learn Korean. Like the Birch papers does have access to, at the very least, at least the Korean elite, the Korean leaders. And even that minimum is hard to find in a lot of the English language scholarship. It's like they'll talk about Ri, and that's it, or Kim Il-sung, and they're both puppets.
yeah.
And so even like the elites, the political leaders don't have agency, and they certainly aren't talking about Kim Gu, Chang Deok-soo, and
Well,
these other
what's
figures.
funny about the KDP is that's exactly what, within 1 week, what the American occupation leaders thought of these educated, rich Koreans. And I actually tracked down Cho Byung-ok. I got my degree at Columbia. He never got a PhD at Columbia.
Oh, he didn't?
No, I went to the alumni office and I spelled it CHOUGH, as he did sometimes, blah, blah, blah. They had no record of him.
That's
Whereas
fascinating.
Chang Tek-sang went to Edinburgh University in Scotland. That's true.
Okay. Were you able to verify his graduate degree?
Well, I had a friend
Europe,
who verified it in Scotland. But, I mean, how many people went to Edinburgh University? How many Koreans in the colonial period? I mean, more than one? I wanted to ask you, why do you think they're so... Well, let me just stop a second, because I think it's interesting. I interviewed Leonard Birch in 1971 or 2, and he was flat on his back on a bed. He had some sort of disease that paralyzed him, and so his wife would, come to the bed and feed him, and he had to be helped up to go to the bathroom and all of that, and he lay there all afternoon telling me about his experience in Korea, and it was just crystal clear memory because he got this disease shortly after he left Korea. And it was the high point of his life.
Yeah.
I didn't know there were any Birch papers. His wife or relatives never told me that, but it was remarkable. He's a very bright man, and he had become, just by incessant study, by far the most knowledgeable person on Korean politics in the occupation. But I've never forgotten seeing this guy who had been on his back in a bed for like 15 years after he got back from
Wow, that's
Korea.
remarkable. I tried to sort of follow up, and I couldn't find. There was no paper trail after. Because a lot of the reformers came back. Like Arthur Bruns worked for the kind of economic team during the Korean War. He dies of a heart attack during the war. But
Is that right? I didn't know.
Yeah. But a bunch of people, these reformers have afterlives. Stuart Meacham goes on being the leader of the anti-war movement, of course. There's two figures. Roger Baldwin, who starts the ACLU, he becomes a really kind of rabid anti-communist after
His papers in 1947, I think he visits Korea.
Yeah.
They're very interesting because he's just finding out all this horrible
Yeah. And he's
human
not
rights abuses.
And he's certainly not he's not a sympathizer of the left. He becomes, I think in the 50s and 60s, Ingu Huang writes about him. He becomes a real rabid kind of anti-red, almost a red baiter at that point. And then Ernst Fraenkel, who's the legal advisor, he also becomes kind of red, maybe not a red baiter, that's too strong, but very, very strongly anti-communist. But when they're all there in the occupation, there's a consensus that like, the Americans are screwing up. Yeah. And there's obvious answers. And even among these groups, there are clearly political differences among them. I think like Meacham and Boontz are sort of further to the left, and Baldwin and Franco and these other figures are a little bit further to the right on these questions. But on the question of the occupation and how it's being run and organized, there's complete consensus among these men that it's not being run well, and there's obvious. They see what the problems are, and the solutions are there, and they're just frustrated that Hodge.
Well, it's remarkable. Frankel was the only real expert on military occupations in the Korea, in the military government. He had written a book on the Rhineland after World War I, where they had people's committees in the Rhineland, and he goes into great detail about how the authorities dealt with these leftist people's committees in the Rhineland. So he was perfect for the job he had. Let me see if I can ask you maybe one or two more questions before we open it up. Why do you think there's so few serious studies of the occupation of South Korea? I mean, if you look at the occupation of Japan or Germany or Austria, for that matter, there's so much more literature.
Yeah.
I mean, you filled in a lot of literature, but...
Again, I'm not saying that this is just truth. Your book casts a long shadow. Am I wrong? It's tough. I mean, there's a reason why Eric Foner, there hasn't been a follow-up to Reconstruction. Eric Foner's Reconstruct. There's a lot of interest in Reconstruction, but writing a kind of synthetic account, and that was published in 1988.
Well, I didn't think you were going to say that, actually.
Well, I think that's...
I always told my students, if they wanted to write about the occupation or the Korean War or whatever, just, we have so few books on these subjects, and if you look at a library, about the Vietnam War or the lead up to the Vietnam War, that dozens and dozens more books than on Korea.
Yeah. I think it's also the stalemate. Right, the Korean War ends in a stalemate, and so, this is there's no definitive outcome of winning or losing in this particular case, and it seems like for the U.S. to remember something, they either have to be definitive winners or they have to be definitive losers, is what it seems like. And in the case of Korea, it's very ambiguous, what the result is, and maybe that has something to do. And that's probably one of the reasons that the Korean War is, was for a long time the forgotten war. I don't think that's as much true anymore. But yeah, it's one of these wars that end in stalemate. It's not over yet, and so again, I think without a definitive outcome in the minds of Americans, definitively winning or losing, I guess they didn't have an interest in it.
I think it also has to do with North Korea being such a bad example of communism. Yeah. And people assume that it's always been like that, whereas, as you and I were talking about yesterday, really, the current regime is a post-1960s regime. Yeah. It was more or less a coalition of the left in the late 40s.
Yeah.
Let me just ask one more question. You mentioned this. I think you and I are the only people I've ever seen mention it. That a grenade was thrown at Kim Il-sung on the March 1st anniversary of 1919 in 1946, and a Soviet guard grabbed the grenade and it went off in his hand and blew his arm off. And he became a friend of...
Yeah, a lifetime friend. A lifetime friend.
He better be a friend.
Yeah.
But that was one assassination. Song Jin-woo in December 1945 was another. Yo Eun-hyung, Chang Duk-soo, these were all the right wing. And we always assume that if somebody's assassinated in a situation like this, it's the communists who are doing it. No. And when I actually, twist my arm, what do I think about it? I think that probably helped them a lot. Yo Eun-hyung was a dominant figure, on the left and right. I mean, he was just the guy that was meant to be president of a post-Japanese Korea. And I don't know about the others, but Kim Gu in 1949 also.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting coda to most of the violence came from the right.
Yeah. And it seems like, we don't have definitive information on all of them, but it seems like Kim Gu had his hand in a large majority. Even the
was
grenade
hardly
bombing
innocent.
of
Yeah,
Kim Il Sung,
yeah.
There were reports that it was mostly that that implicated Kim Gu for organizing that particular
One of his
assassination.
nicknames was the assassin,
Yeah, right.
because he also tried to assassinate the Japanese foreign minister in
Right.
Shanghai in 1929.
Yeah.
For those of you that have watched the eternal footage of MacArthur taking the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945 in Tokyo Bay on USS Missouri, Foreign Minister Shigemitsu comes hobbling onto the stage with a cane because Kim Gu blew his leg off in 1929.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which nobody ever points out.
Yeah.
Let me stop there and we can open it up to questions from the audience.
Yeah.